I know sometimes things always make sense to you, right?
Minority shareholder, how would I put it? Traps for young and old players.
Yes.
We've acted for many minority shareholders over the years.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, we've probably acted for, I've acted for all, majority and minority shareholders, but minority shareholders, particularly when clients are at the earlier stage of their life cycle in business.
Yep.
People looking to get into companies.
Yes.
People looking to invest relatively small amounts of capital. There are difficulties out there in terms of how they invest that capital and how, and more relevantly, how they protect themselves.
Yeah, I mean, it's not even sort of the quantum of capital. It's more just the relative, when you're buying a big majority shareholding, it's actually just as important when you're doing that smaller investment when you're starting out, because it really is just vital to get it right in the first place, because sort of the nature of the beast with these minority shareholdings really sort of turns on the rights or lack thereof that you may really have in terms of the functional way this whole company is actually going to be run.
Yeah. And the default position, of course, is the law under the Companies Act 1993 and the rights of all shareholders. I'll start that again. The rights of the Companies Act sets out the rights, of course, of all shareholders. It largely doesn't differentiate between majority and minority rights, except for a couple of provisions such as minority buyout rights, which we'll cover shortly.
Yeah.
So it doesn't differentiate in a way that gives, in our view, doesn't, Liam, a proportionate level of comfort for what are putatively a lot less powerful actors. Minority shareholders are almost completely different legal creature to a majority shareholder.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it's just because it turns on the fact that you just inherently just have less shares, right? It's just a
function of
5 shares versus having 75.
Yep.
Because all of those shares, just on the presumption everyone has the same class of shares, they're all just treated equally, and just the chip, so to speak, that you can spend. Just having more is more and having less is less. And so that reflects in things like, your ability to even sit at the table with decision making
on the board.
On the board, exactly. Sort of big major transactions, which do require at least 75% of these shares. So that's a big important thing, that these sort of smaller players may or may not actually have a chance to sort of be a part of. And that's why that's really important to guard yourself against these in the first instance when you're getting in. So if you were just to buy in straight away 5% of a company with no other sort of security parameters, you really are at the whim, more or less, of these guys, whoever you're getting into. So it's really important you do your DD, not just on the company itself, but the people behind it. How do they operate, and has there been minority shareholders before? Are you one of many, or are you the first one that they've dealt with? Because it's really important to know how you're going to be treated if you don't have those sort of security safeguards, like things like shareholders agreements, which help regulate or can go some lengths to mitigate the deficiencies of your sort of shareholding position vis-a-vis the majority shareholder. I think we'll get into that a bit later.
That's a great point about looking behind the people, not just the company. So looking behind the company, you go to your accountant, they look at the balance sheet, they might look at GST returns, they'll ask accountants questions around the performance of the business. But it's one thing to be a minority shareholder in a successful business from an accounting perspective, or even from a market perspective. It's yet another to be involved with a successful business that also has good, decent people behind it that will treat a minority shareholder who at law doesn't have the same rights as we've been just laboring in the last 5 minutes. You don't have a lot of power, and it is a little bit of the Wild West, isn't it, Liam, in terms of how you enforce minority shareholder rights. And we'll talk about a little bit about that soon. But looking behind the people, that the amount of discretion that majority shareholders have and the board will have, particularly if you're not on it and don't have a seat at the table, is quite extreme. So, and there are, you know, and Liam, you're more au fait than I am with some of the work you've done in the last few years in terms of looking at oppressed shareholder claims and some of the disputes we've dealt with.
Yep.
It can be challenging, can't it, as a minority shareholder to actually argue, like say, for example, you go, you know, you have two guys and they're in business together and, you know, it's 80-20 and that minority shareholder there was an informal discussion that he would be paid out at the end of every year
Yep.
a share of profits after reasonable expenses, any capex expenses were paid, right?
Yep.
And you know, reinvesting for growth. If, however, that person turns around on a whim, the majority shareholder, and says, "Nah, actually, I think we're going super well, and that capital is better used to be fused back into the business for more growth."
Yep.
He might be 50, the majority might be 28. He may be very happy to reinfuse that capital back into the business because it suits him, because he's paid off most of his mortgage, his kids have grown up, and he is feeling pretty laissez-faire about the whole cash flow situation. 28-year-old might be sitting there going, actually, I'd love, you know, 22,000 or 53,000 that would have been the cash coming out of that business, because my interest rate's just gone from 3.5% to 7%. You know, we've just had another kid. My wife's not working at the moment, or maybe he's not working at the moment. You know, and that is an altogether those two people.
Bargain, really,
it's a different bargain. So what you need to do is you need to come to people like us, come to us, you know, please.
Or Kerry.
And yeah, no, 100%. And it's just like, it's also just looking at what type, on a similar sort of vein to that, it's also looking at what type of businesses. You know, is this going to be just a business you're getting in for growth, or are you expecting it's like Shane was sort of setting out, almost dividends being paid out, something like that? Because it's as Shane said, we've done a few prejudiced shareholder claims where the suggestion was basically that, you know, they were going to be paid out these dividends throughout the year, but then it just started, they just retained all those earnings, and all of a sudden,
and there's precious little that the minority can do. There's nothing in the Companies Act that says money must be paid out at these junctures or when these trigger events happen. So you need a shareholders agreement that actually says, if the minority shareholder is that worried about having a say or a seat at the table in terms of when the dividends are paid out, they should be on the board, first of all. If they're not, because the majority, you know, either the minority balance is such that the minority hasn't put enough capital in, or isn't sufficiently senior, or hasn't brought enough other assets or skills to the table, or isn't doing enough labor to justify a seat at the table, you might have it where the dividend policy is actually, the dividend policy alone is determined by unanimously by the shareholders, as opposed to the board, which would determine everything else, because the default position under the Companies Act is that the board will determine the dividend policy. There are other things to think about in this regard as well. Like, for example, you could have it where dividends will be paid out as long as a certain level of net profit is achieved. If not, the money is reinfused into the business, and that should be articulated very clearly in the shareholders agreement, because then there is a crystal clear to pay out once that event happens. And what you're doing when you agree in a shareholders agreement or constitution like that, you are trading you are preempting later circumstances which are reasonably foreseeable in a small, closely held company, by doing it at a time where everybody is happy, everybody is together. Yes. And then if there is a divergence of approach or divergence of life circumstances, you've already pre-agreed what's going to happen in these very foreseeable situations that are going to always crop up in different shapes or forms in closely held companies.
Yeah, I mean, largely when someone is coming on board, both parties, on either side of the table, are accepting there's going to be some degree of negotiation. You know, it's very not very rare, but often is the case that it's not just a complete one-sided, here's the only thing I'm going to agree, and you either agree or walk away kind of thing. Yeah. So it's always good to try sort of push for these things at these earlier stages. And exactly like Shane said, rather than hope that maybe you can try and negotiate or ask for it later down the line.
I just have to interrupt you for a moment. This is a very amateur hour move here in the recording studio. I don't think I don't think the computer's got a lot of juice left in it. We're just gonna you hold the floor, mate.
I'll do my little song and dance.
Do your little song and dance.
It's all right. Yeah, so it's what's important is, as we've sort of now labored again, is these shareholders agreements at the front end. Now, many people would consider these, depending on the lengths of the negotiations and back and forth, they could consider them, just for the first time they're doing them, relatively expensive, and they wouldn't be entirely wrong. But when you weigh it against the importance of what this can actually secure you in the position of a minority shareholder, they really truly do pay dividends. And it's always our advice that if you're doing this, this is something you absolutely need to pay for, because realistically, it's the most expensive way to do something is to do it cheaply. And so, to try sort of hold on to, say, another $2,000, $3,000, whatever it is, and
$10,000.
10,000, but then pay over, $15,000, 5%, but all of a sudden you really have your arms tied and there's nothing you can do. It's you bet you'll be wishing you paid that extra $2,000 to really secure that position.
Yeah, just pre-agreeing everything and turning your mind to things. Just as another vivid example of that, is if you have two parties coming together and they do have relatively disparate life circumstances and needs for money to come out, and essentially completely different actors in the same business charged with doing very different tasks and have very different reasons for getting into the business in the first place. Like we just talked about, the one person, the minority, could be wanting a return on investment. They're not doing too much, and they were sold a dream that they would put 100,000 in, for example, and receive approximately 20 to 30 grand a year back once the business started making some decent money. Now, if that's the case, they need, like we talked about, dividend policy at length, but also they need to be able to act in their best interests rather than the directors. Now, the default position under the Companies Act is that the director must act in the best interests of the company at all times. You can contract out of that under the constitutional shareholders agreement by having a provision which states that a particular shareholder may act in the best interest of, a particular director may act in the best interest of the shareholder that appointed them. Now, that might sound like a triviality or legalese. Let us assure you that it's not. And the reason it's not is, if you're in dispute, you may want to do things as a director which favor your interests as a shareholder. And they can be quite different from the interests of the company. Sometimes, in some of the disputes we've acted on, it's been a wholly material point to the extent that it would be the difference between a shareholder being able to bring a claim against the other shareholder for breaching that duty to act in the best interest of the company because they preferred their own interests and they had no entitlement to do so under the shareholders agreement or constitution. That's just one vivid example of something that the parties need to turn their mind to when they are negotiating a shareholders agreement. Well, one, they should be doing a shareholders agreement, but they need to turn their mind to something like that, because to not do so can be all the difference in the world between having a meaningful or cogent claim that you can come to someone like us and say, I need to, this person agreed when we entered business, it was on this premise. And the fact that it was on this premise is what actually induced me to enter into the agreement to buy the shares and contribute to the capital and time and know-how to the company. I'm now not getting the return I was promised. And absent a contractual documentation that gives you the right to prefer your own interests, pull money out of the company and essentially have the bargain that you allege was struck to be honored, you could find yourself between a rock and a hard place. And Liam, you can speak to this now, but it can be I always say to clients, it's the Wild West trying to enforce rights in small, closely held companies in New Zealand. The cost, the stress, and of trying to get someone, particularly if you don't have contractual provisions that favor you, such as a shareholders agreement constitution, the bar can be almost unbearably high, can't it?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, say you didn't have a shareholders agreement and you don't have that much more sort of clear-cut claim against another shareholder. As Shane said, I mean, there really is very little avenues, and the one real avenue you do have, which is the oppressed, prejudiced shareholder Section 174 claim, I mean, the hurdles is usually financial, and it's also time consuming. I mean, to go through the actual courts, to try basically get what a shareholder agreement could do, get to a position that if you negotiate it in the first instance, can be incredibly expensive and time consuming, you know. So while you may feel the pain now, it could actually be, you know, months, if not a year, until an actual results also delivered. So it's yeah, just
And the irony as well is, and clients can be left feeling exasperated at the court system, at us, and their plight in general, when they realise that it's a complete round robin, in the sense that a High Court judge will often try to put a framework in place which still allows, because they don't like interfering with private individuals and the bargains they strike.
Yeah, and they still look at the actual whole thing in context. They don't necessarily just come from your subjective point of view, right? It's just you know, it'd be much easier for everyone if the court just decided how you wanted to play it. But yeah, they take into broader considerations all the contextual elements.
Yeah.
So while you may feel very specific about a type of way, once that sort of more objective step moved is taken, all of a sudden it could actually still thwart, or at least again put up more obstacles, delay a result, and it's just more legal fees, and that may actually be your undoing. So while you still may have a tenable claim somewhat, it might just be, you know, you just run out of gas in the tank, and it's just
yeah, because the court's
over.
looking at it, like Liam just said, they're impressing on an objective framework, and they're deducing that the best they can from what they can see in terms of evidence as to the intention of the parties based on the applicable law. Now, that can be either the Companies Act or the Companies Act and the Shareholders and the Constitution. So when they're looking at that, it's, when I say it's a round robin, it's more of a, I don't know if that's really a very good metaphor, but I just love it rolling off the tongue. It gives me great joy. Gary Busey in Entourage, yeah, gravity, inertia, and physics. It's a round robin, but it is a bit of a boomerang, if you like, in the sense that you go off to the court, and the court just will superimpose an interpretation and a logic that the parties couldn't come to themselves to actually get an outcome that won't add anything or make a decision beyond what the parties could have done themselves if they'd sat down initially, preferably without lawyers and the cost of us, and to sit down and try and understand what everyone's rights are, understand the bargain that they agreed to, and be reasonable to have some sort of negotiated exit or compromise in terms of an outcome that everyone can stomach to some extent. Then the lawyers get involved and say, this is the law, this is the position. And from there, they try and get a compromised or a negotiated settlement where everyone's happy. If that can't be done, you go after the court and you spend tens or hundreds of thousands to get the judge to essentially, what will often happen, and we did a few, didn't we, Liam, last year, where the judge would just come back and say, okay, here's what Section 174 says, here's what the Companies Act says, here's what all the documents say, and now we're going to get, for example, Party A who wants to buy out Party B, we're going to get the parties to, but then Party B wants to also buy out Party A, because there is real value in the balance sheet of the company and the expected growth of the company. So if both people want to, in that sort of situation, this is one we acted on a few years ago, both people want the company, then everyone's doing all sorts of skullduggery to try and make the company look less valuable than it really is. So the court will say something like, we're going to have essentially like a shootout. So you're both going to make an offer, and the offer is going to be your best offer. It can be done blind, and that will be, so then you have less incentive. If you want it, you want the company, then you're going to say, okay, go and get it valued. And I think it's worth X. But if you're disingenuous about your valuation, you risk losing the company. So there's all sorts of things like that the court will actually suggest, and the discretion or latitude that a court will apply to a situation is actually more creative than perhaps in other types of dispute, because of the nature.
They do have a real wide discretion. It's basically they can anything they see fit, and then they sort of give a few examples in the clause as well. But it's
and they often won't have as much sympathy for a hardened, experienced commercial party in terms of them trying to assert either ignorance of the law or a lack of sophistication. Sorry, going to go off. A lack of sophistication in terms of they didn't have their eyes wide open when they went into it. They're more likely to say, you guys are experienced commercial parties. this is the law and the chips are going to fall where they lie. It's much more challenging to just play sort of the little old lady syndrome if I didn't know what I was doing. All right, guys, we have waxed lyrical about the thoroughly exciting and completely undry topic of minority shareholder rights. We hope there's a few little nuggets of wisdom in there for you. Give us a shout out, on either any of the social media platforms. Maybe not our YouTube channel, which is yet to take off as yet, but it's a work in progress. It's a work in progress. We hold high hopes for YouTube. We know we have a couple of keen followers on YouTube, but I'm unsure as to whether that's going to
a small but sort of devoted minority.
Yeah, a smattering of support. No applause. All right, guys, I'm trying to get the outro song going, but I don't know if I've got it. Here we go. A little bit of Mockingbird. Here we go. Excellent. Thank you.
Real slick affair.
Things may not always make sense to you right now.